Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, gives professionals the opportunity to bring in valuable skills, tools, and resources organizations need to bridge the generational gap and ensure inclusive growth. JEDI plus JSSJ is more than an educational program. It's a call to action to improve the future of every Jewish institution. Join the growing list of organizations committed to JEDI education and values as a profound pathway to a more just and inclusive world. Apply by August 1st and get in on fall classes beginning soon. Just head to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 386, Converting to Judaism, Becoming Ger-ish. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are absolutely thrilled to be launching a series of episodes exploring the topic of conversion to Judaism. We've discussed conversion here and there, but this is the first time we've done a deep dive with many conversations in a row, all about the ways in which Jews by choice make Judaism more spectacular and more diverse. So to be clear, this unit of episodes is not some kind of debate about the pros and cons of conversion. Hopefully it's clear to everyone who's ever listened to Judaism Unbound that we think conversion is and converts are, without question, wonderful. And all of these episodes are basically just counting the ways. But what we will do over the next bunch of weeks is feature a variety of folks who can, through their own stories, life experience, and analysis, help us think more expansively about the particular ways in which conversion serves to strengthen contemporary Jewish life, and understanding that, how we can ensure that the people who do convert are treated with the full respect and honor that they deserve, and that is essential to unlock their Torah. And we can't imagine there could possibly be a better guest, so to speak, you'll understand why I say that in a minute, to kick off this series of episodes than our own colleague here at Judaism Unbound, Katie Kaestner-Frenchman. Katie is our marketing and communications and creative maven, and everything that you have seen over the last bunch of years from Judaism Unbound, from Jewish Live, from the Unyeshiva, if you have looked at that stuff and said, that looks good, or I understand what they're talking about, or that is a very short and simple message for Judaism Unbound. I am used to these very long, convoluted conversations on the podcast, or Judaism Unbound has a really good-looking website, or I really like my Judaism Unbound merch. Well, all of that is thanks to Katie. And so we are so thrilled to have them on the podcast with their voice. I suppose that you have figured out, given that Katie is here on this launch episode for our series on converting to Judaism, that Katie converted to Judaism. We actually first met Katie because they wrote an article in Hey Alma. Katie wrote an article about their conversion process to Judaism and talked about how Judaism Unbound was a central part of that conversion story. And I think it was the first article that we had read where somebody said that. So we said we should talk to this person. And it turned out that Katie had incredible skills to contribute to Judaism Unbound, which for a while they actually contributed as a volunteer and only later became somebody that was professionally on the Judaism Unbound team. Katie has been Lex's and my close partner in everything that we've done. Just a little more introduction. In addition to being our marketing and communications and creative maven at Judaism Unbound, Katie Kaestner-Frenchman has also served as a marketer, editor, designer, and writer at several justice-focused organizations and nonprofits across the globe, as well as helping a bunch of our friends out there in the Jewish world with their marketing and design needs. Katie has long been an advocate of non-traditional, digital-first Jewish life and education, having spent most of their adult life in places without progressive English-speaking Jewish communities. They were selected for the 2019 Yaad Young Adult Leadership Fellowship with the UK Reform Movement, and also were the convener of New Moons Manchester, a seasonal earth-based queer Rosh Chodesh gathering. Katie Kaestner-Frenchman has lived in 14 cities around the world and currently can be found in and around Madrid, Spain, and of course, in the digital realms of Judaism Unbound. So, Katie Kaestner-Frenchman, it is so weird to say this, but welcome to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you, and I want to say that existentially as well as here on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. It's really exciting to be on this side after spending a long time really getting to know the back end, so to speak.
Well, I'm really excited about the graphic that you're going to create for this episode. It's probably going to be the best one ever. So, anyway, Katie, I wanted to start by asking you where you think we should start, in the sense that when we're talking about conversion, right, neither Lex nor I have converted to Judaism. And so there are ways in which I think it would be interesting to know where you think we should start this, not only this episode, but this whole series. What stories do you think are most important?
Yeah, I love that you use story because I think that's where to begin. So I sat down before this, really trying to get down notes, like go through paper, go through my journals from when I was like earlier in the process. And I put together the story, it's just long, it's really long and complex. And I think that's something that when I'm around other people who are Jews by choice, it's those stories that get condensed and simplified, and a lot of assumptions are made about people. And like our stories are really, really cool and they're really complicated. Like they're tinged with things that sometimes can be nerve-wracking to talk about, particularly in Jewish spaces, and lots of things that are nerve-wracking to talk about in non-Jewish spaces. And I don't know that many people who feel completely safe with their entire conversion story, even if like your spouse is, I married a Jewish person. It's not how this started, but people really just assume that when they meet me. I dragged him willingly, joyfully, not kicking and screaming, but back into like Jewish practices, and definitely not the other way around. This is the world's most abbreviated version. I tried to do a long version to include all of the like weird nuance, but obviously it's a human life. So the real broad strokes are that I grew up in a family that was Christian. I enjoyed participating in religion. I have a really strong like spiritual inner life. So it always made a lot of sense to me. I have an uncle who's a religion nerd who like converted to Catholicism and left university to be a monk. He's also the only like queer elder in my family. He's gay. And I have a scientist father who's a pretty devout Protestant Christian. And I also grew up in a church that was really tough. When you're growing up as a girl, if you're queer, if you're different really in all of the ways that I'm different, it's tough. And I wanted to be a religion nerd. And I had a really large rupture that sort of sent me into my own little world where I didn't want to stop identifying as someone who was a Christian, because I was like really interested in God. I was like, I wasn't just interested in God, I was interested in the Bible and in Christian biblical scholarship. Like I had a colleague who's now a Methodist pastor, like openly queer Methodist pastor. She's amazing. She gave me a book to help me called Reading God and Finding God in Tyrannical Texts about Paul, because Paul was killing me. And she had been to seminary. She was like, all right, like we have different ways of engaging with text. We all do. The Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible or whatever, Quran, all of it. We have methods. And that weirdly, it coincided at the time when I met the first Jewish person who loved being Jewish. An ex, not like a starry-eyed, wonderful relationship either. Like, so I know that it was the Judaism I was in love with. I was like, oh yeah, no, I didn't like that. That was a really rough one. And I met this person who loved being Jewish in my early 20s and like loved it so much, loved culturally being Jewish, and just was like, come in, like, come. We're going to watch Spaceballs. And like, my mom loves Mel Brooks, but like, you watch Spaceballs with like a Jewish college kid in Philly. And it's like, it's a different experience. And took me to my first deli and was just like, loved it.
By the way, I love this story of the breaking the stereotype of the person who falls in love with the Judaism, but not the Jew. And it's like the opposite of the stereotype story where you're coming for the Jewish person.
That is, I had never noticed that before. But yeah, that's basically exactly what happened. And I was doing a lot of work in art history around this, encountering Jewish lines of my own family, which I have a very complicated relationship with, because I have often felt internal pressure to amplify the fact that like there's a thread of my family who are Yucca Jews, which is Jews from Germany. That doesn't matter to me personally, almost at all. But I have many times like said that it did. And I gave myself an excuse by a university to learn a huge amount about Judaism in the United States. I started buying Jewish studies books. And skip ahead, I moved to the West Bank, to Nablus. I had to leave. My visa basically got rejected. It was 2014. It was a very tough time to. Israel didn't love the idea of having lots of foreigners in the West Bank and in a very contentious city. So I landed in Germany where I met my spouse, my husband, who happens to be Jewish, and started listening to Judaism Unbound and started realized that I was queer, started coming into myself in Germany in that way that sometimes you can when you have really great deep love, like really healthy relationships. I was like, I'm queer. And I was like going through and one day I was like, I had already known. And one day I worked up the courage to tell my husband, like, I think I'm Jewish. And he just went, I know.
Love it. Wow. So that's really gorgeous. And I'm curious throughout this unit to do like some hopping back and forth tonally.
Yeah.
Because first, there's a lot of things that you've already shown a light on in your brief comments so far that are frustrating and challenging about how Jewish communities treat converts. I think you've started to hint at some of those things. Elements of your story that you're asked to care more about or less about, forms of your story that you're supposed to have ready, and ideas about why one converts related to spouses, etc. That's all important, and we're going to talk about, I hope, all of those different threads throughout this series. I also want to be really careful to always hold that, like, Jews by choice are awesome. Converts are amazing. This is great and joyous and wonderful. And a huge reason why we're having this unit is that over the years, like, it's not that our organization has ever been like an organization for converts. It wouldn't make sense. Neither Dan or I ourselves have converted, so we're not positioned to be the leaders of that. But we have learned in recent years that, like, a lot of people who are at various different points on journeys of going from not Jewish to Jewish, and I'm like, be careful with how I phrase that, because there's people that are not Jewish at all, and like, just this is one of their first entryways into learning little bits and pieces. There's people who are like actively in some kind of conversion class and listen to our podcast for that reason. We get all sorts of emails on this front. By the way, we're going to talk all about like the idea of Jews by choice, quote unquote, the idea of converts. There's a lot of language things that are really complicated. I've talked to folks who converted who are like really passionate about, no, I'm a convert. I'm not a Jew by choice. I've also talked to people who are like, no, I'm a Jew by choice, not a convert. But like, all of that is to say, converts, Jews by choice, absolutely amazing, really stellar, wonderful folks. What are some of the things you think that group of folks who started not Jewish and became Jewish bring to Jewish life? Like, what are some of the superpowers?
Yeah, we are really cool. I heard this incredible thing the other day, actually something the Jewish Farming Network put on. And it was, and I don't know where they were quoting, but a piece of Jewish wisdom that prophets don't come from the land where they are working, is where they are prophets, right? No man's a prophet in his own city. That really fundamentally is a huge part of it, because first of all, when you come in and it is hard and it's full of a lot of stigma and confusing feelings, it's objectively a lot of work. You are learning a new language. There's stigma on every single side. You are so wildly, madly in love with this thing that you have to do it.
And sorry, I want to clarify. You're learning a new language in the sense of learning like a new cultural language and maybe also a literal language, but like
exactly.
Yeah,
yeah. It's incredible, and the pressure to assimilate in certain spaces is huge. And I did it all here in Europe and the UK, where even more so, I was in community with people where it was really, really hard. Like, if you convert and you live in Germany or Spain, you have to want it so deeply, desperately, crazy badly, because it's hard. And also, you see a lot of those tension points that people can ignore when they're born in. And if you have the chutzpah to call it out, which is something that I personally like largely initiated via this podcast, not just like gas you up, but truly, I was told enough times that it was okay for me to make things up. Then converts are saying really radical things. That like sacredness, that you can't touch it. I definitely know people who've converted who feel that way, 100%. But our audience, like Judaism Unbound people, where we're so comfortable playing with things. I don't have that fear in my bones, and I had to work through that. But there are things that I can't know really deeply, truly. And like then that informs a lot of our pressure points. All of them really come from like a place of fear.
That's so fascinating that you're saying that it's the lack of fear. And usually I think we think of people who are converting or people who are immigrating, let's say, as people who have a set of fears, right? They have a set of fears like, I'm not going to fit in, I'm not going to have friends, I'm not going to speak the language. But that and all that I think is true for people that are converting to Judaism, right? But you're pointing out that there's also a set of things that they are not afraid of that potentially gives them a superpower, right? Which is that I'm not afraid maybe of these Jewish continuity fears that we're the last generation of Jews breaking the chain, right? Or I'm not afraid that I'm going to go to hell for not believing this or that because, like I've already worked through that situation from my previous religion. So I'm imagining that, you're not like I'm jumping from one fear of hell to another fear of hell. You're saying that's not on my radar anymore or something like that. And that sounds freeing. I mean, I've never thought of it quite that way before, but it's fascinating to hear it in your voice.
It is. I will say it goes well when you have people in positions of leadership and authority, whether that's rabbis, friends, people who run Jewish media, who are saying it's okay to play and it's okay to be creative. Then I'll take a bigger risk because like I can. And there's also the fact that I think we understand that like continuity isn't scary, right? My family is mixed by virtue of me being Jewish. The Jewish family I married into is completely mixed. The person who was giving me my tips to fast for my first Yom Kippur was my mother-in-law, who is not a Jew. I have seen, and I'm living, and I'm polyamorous. So while I have a Jewish husband, I have non-Jewish partners. I am seeing out in the world just how strong Judaism is and how like cool it is. And how it's really vibrant. It's vibrant because of this ecosystem of converts and non-Jewish partners and people, the ger, like an outsider. I love the word ger personally. This idea of being being outside of the people and coming in.
So just to clarify that ger is a word that in the Bible means an immigrant or a foreigner, but later in Rabbinic Judaism came to be the word that they use to mean somebody who's converted to Judaism. But it comes from this root that means to live somewhere that you're not originally from, basically.
Which I've spent my entire life doing. Like I've moved 14 different times, and you really do. You get to come in and there's so much energy. And when people meet you, when you have I had a really great rabbi who met me, and I'd already been, the reason why my husband said, I know you're Jewish is we reinvented Shabbat in the house already. We did creative Shabbat instead of rest Shabbat. And all we did was create. We didn't consume anything passively. That's so cool. Like I was just doing that alone. Like I was building this alone. I met a rabbi who heard about where I was at and was just like, great, let's have you lead stuff. Moishe House has a new program. Do you want to lead like a mini Moishe House? Knowing full well that I hadn't gotten to the Beit Din. That final step of conversion where you see, you talk to three rabbis, people in your movement, and they have a discussion with you and say, you're ready or not ready. I'm not even sure I had begun conversion classes. I had just asked her because I just moved to the country from Germany, and immediately was like, okay, you've got weird ideas. You care a lot. Let's put you in front of people. Who says that to someone who's a convert in progress? I mean, I was a specific kind of case, but that meant everything.
I want to stick in superpower land. This is very, very fun so far. I'm going to do a Lex wordplay. There tends to be at least one of these per unit, and this one's coming bright and early in our conversion unit. You talked about your love of the word ger, which it's kind of beautiful actually, because its root is about dwelling a place. It's about where you do dwell. Like gar, it's used both for like where you dwell, and ger is also associated with like foreigner or stranger or outsider. So it's this like oxymoronic thing that has elements of being part of a community and also elements of not being part of that community. And that's why in many situations, there's this funny term that's used, resident alien. It's like a hyphenated term that is used in translations of the Bible, resident while also alien, living here while also afar. And so there's something beautiful about that. But I'm doing my interlingual pun time. There's an English word, Ger-ish. I've never thought about it in connection to Ger before, but you were literally talking about how there's this vibrancy, this energy, this like overwhelming enthusiasm that many Gerim, many converts, Jews by choice, have. And Ger-ish, of course, means it's not always a positive term, but we love on Judaism Unbound taking negatively connoted terms and embracing them. Ger-ish is, of course, a word for like overly showy.
It's dead queer.
Right.
It's real queer. Yeah.
Right. And so I'm ready to propose Ger-ish as like a new term that we use. Maybe we spell it with the Gimel Resh and then the ISH. I don't know. Like somebody figure out a cool graphic, or we have a marketing person who's our guest today, Katie, who might be able to run with this. So like I'm really interested in holding that vibrant energy piece as another superpower. Like I want to delineate some of these things very clearly. Not that they're true across the board. Like some of these, it's both, there's a truth to them and they're like a stereotype. Some converts are not just like, but others, when you're new to something, it feels exciting. It feels enticing. And I think the superpower that's lurking there is there's an ability to notice the magic of Judaism that many Jews by birth, because it's just what we have had in our lives for a while, we're just like, okay, so like Passover Seder, whatever. It comes and we speed through the parts and we get to the meal. But then sometimes I've had Passover Seders where whether it's a Jew by choice or this, sometimes it's true of the non-Jews in the room for whom stuff is new. But the superpower is, wait, wow, there's all these cool things happening here. Wait, we're having a ritual that is about like constantly interrupting each other and asking questions. We actively empower the youngest kid in the room to do something as a leader, where we have a bunch of wine, where we where there's foods that are symbolic meanings tied to a cool story about liberation. Like all of a sudden you notice stuff that can just sort of be, it can become the background noise. It can become the water we're swimming in, and we might not notice the magic. So I'm curious, like, talk to us about this this Ger-ish quality, this convert-ish quality of bringing some unbridled enthusiasm, bringing some energy to spaces that candidly often just lack it.
Yeah. I was thinking first about how many neurodivergent converts I know, including myself, and how many like people with ADHD and autism I meet in my journeys all over the world who are converts, because there's an added little bit of like learning something and becoming so holy engrossed. And we don't really have the switch that says you shouldn't become holy engrossed. So you can just go. Like you just go in and can go really, really, really deep. And it works for things that get so intrinsically interesting and complex and weird and hilarious as you go deeper, like Judaism. You know, you don't always ask questions when you grow up with something. You're like, this is the way it is. And that's so much of what we do at Judaism Unbound, like unlearning. If you have to learn and unlearn, and you don't have to do any of the unlearning process, and all you can do is do a wild deep dive into, I don't know, because you don't say, oh, I know I know about Judaism. No, you got to learn it. I can't speak for people before me and before this time, but we're at a place now where if you're a person with a question, there's some incredible answers out there. And the deeper you go in Judaism, you're just rewarded with like different opportunities and different perspectives and different ways to do and be Jewish, the more you dig in. And if you know what your Passover Seder is, because you've been doing it since you were a kid, you aren't always typically asking, what are the ways I can do this differently? But if you have to do it yourself with like 3 other people, you do the research. That is really energizing.
When I was growing up, I would say that the stereotype of who a convert was would have been somebody who wasn't really doing what you just described. And I guess I want to ask whether that stereotype was wrong back then, or maybe things have changed over the last decades, and maybe part of that is because of the digital revolution or other things. I don't know. But I feel like when I was growing up, I was kind of led with the expectation that if somebody had converted to Judaism, and there were plenty of people in my community who had, that they would be doing the Passover Seder to the T, right? You know, they would be looking up all the official guides because they would want to do it right. You know, and you talked about
to the T in the sense of not messing around and doing new forms of it is what you mean.
Right, by the book, and, not messing around with it because they would, I don't know, be trying to prove something or be trying to establish their sense of authenticity or their acceptance in the community as having authenticity. But my impulse is very much what you just described today. And I'm just thinking back whether it was even true back then. But today, what I just described doesn't sound right at all. I mean, yes, of course, I'm sure that there are some people that have converted to Judaism that have all those concerns and want to do it that way. But my sense from the people that I interact with is exactly what you just described, that these are some of the people who are most creative, most excited to dig in and then sort of find their own creative path. And I'm wondering if it's because something has changed in the Jewish world that kind of says that's okay and allows that, or something else.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that still happens, right? I think people where you get really, I have experienced that personally. There's that character in Mrs. Maisel, which is full of things to like hate watch for as a Jew. But there's this sister-in-law who's a convert, and Tisha B'Av comes and she is fasting, and people are like, "What the heck?" She's at summer vacation. They're out in the mountains at a resort, and she's fasting, and people make fun of her. And she really, truly, like, firmly believes that it's like deeply important. And like, I cried watching it because I've never related to something just so much. So I think there's more information you can find out about Jews and psychedelics and Jews and farming and queer Jews. I met someone who actually is a rabbi now, who is at a house party at college. My friend goes, "Hey, this is Brian. He's going to be a rabbi. He's gay." And I was like, "What? Okay, yeah. Now we're talking about
I think
this."
I know this Brian, and I think he listens to the podcast. So, hey, Brian.
Hi, Brian. We really do have that intensity and want to get it right. I just think that there's more people teaching more interesting forms of Judaism publicly. I think in your day, it would have been your day. When you were growing up, it would have been a thing.
Thanks a lot.
Dan, back in the stoning. No, so I have a question that I spend a lot of time thinking about, an inordinate amount of time, because I teach this class, Jewish Discontinuity, which is all about asking questions about the narrative that Judaism is sort of this thing that has been the same, whether it's for like a few hundred years or a couple thousand years or 5,000 years. And I think about this specific thing, which is when a person converts to Judaism, traditionally, and this is not always how it's done today, they become whatever their name is, Ben or Bat or Mi-Beit, the child of Abraham and Sarah. They become retroactively traced all the way to the beginning of the Jewish people through the first, Jews is anachronistic, but the first Israelites, the first people that are like declared to be part of this group in Genesis. And I have really mixed feelings about that. And I mean mixed. I don't mean negative and I don't mean positive. I mean mixed feelings. And ultimately, like, whatever vibes for a particular person who's converted, what they want their name to be is great. But like, from my perspective, as somebody who has not had to make that choice for myself, I think if I did, it would be a huge struggle for me, because I've spoken with people for whom, like, being traced back to being a Jew their entire life and for a million generations before that, that's not always what feels like the most authentic thing. Like, for some people, the journey of going from not Jewish to Jewish is actually not something to be embarrassed about or erased. It's really good. So when you make I think the reason for that tradition was like a positive reason. I think they wanted people to have a name, because otherwise you would just be your name without child of anyone. And so you just be like, when you're called to the Torah or whatever, it would be obvious to everyone that you're a convert. And so we give you a name, child of Abraham and Sarah, that like you, okay, so
slightly
you're
less
like,
obvious.
Right. But I've spoken with folks and I've seen this in many communities who they say like, no, I'm not erasing my parents' names, like my biological parents' names. Like I want to be child of whatever their names are, and they probably aren't Hebrew connected names, although sometimes they are actually, but like, because Hebrew names have become like secular names. But how might we think both about the specific question of like how people name themselves as converts, but also more generally, like, what do we make of this idea that when somebody converts, we like actively take steps to make their conversion like not obvious to others. On the one hand, I love that, and I like the tradition of like not sort of outing people, for lack of a better word, as converts. And I think it implies that there's something to be ashamed of there. So I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really cool question. I'm excited about this. Okay, so there's really two different things. I'm going to start with the broad one and then specifics, but just because it's midsummer and I had what is usually my annual midsummer party last night. I come from a family from lots of places. My mom's family are ethnically Swedish, and I've spent a non-zero amount of time combining like Swedish and Jewish traditions. So Hanukkah and Santa Lucia fall around each other, and midsummer is a thing that I have in the past, like done like Jewish midsummer. This idea of lineage is invented no matter who you are. In the United States, we feel it, and particularly people like me who are from a number, like ethnically from a number of different places, I can see pretty clearly that my stories of my own ancestry are ones that I have made up for my own benefit. Not entirely, but largely. I have selected the story that is meaningful to me. And when I had to choose a Jewish name, my first name just came to me because it's just very core to who I am. I didn't want to be Abraham and Sarah. I wanted my Jewish parents' names not to be my parents' names. I don't really remember why. I don't remember why, but I landed on a Ruth and Naomi. So that's my Hebrew name, is Child of Ruth and Naomi, because I wanted to trace back to queerness, and that was really critical for me. And that Jewish name process allowed me to do that. But also, I don't think it's important, and I don't even think it's terribly useful to craft any kind of narrative, like a broad narrative of you've always been Jewish necessarily. So there was this class in the Yeshiva taught by Nathaniel Berman, and it was about this idea of a Gilgul Nefesh, of revolution of the soul, which it gets complicated. But one of the big takeaways is the fact that like there is a sort of within like mystic writing ideas of reincarnation. There's also ideas of like souls changing in one's lifetime, which is a convert and a non-binary person. And I don't think I was a Jew when I was a kid necessarily. Like that feels weird to me. Like I do feel like I had this Jewish soul. It got me in a lot of trouble. Like I got in a lot of trouble at church, and I still kept going back because I was into it. I was like, let me fight with you. So I mean, to be fair, but I didn't identify that way. And I don't think that I was a trans kid, which is an experience that some people have. And then I realized that there's a structure for having changes of the soul, and not everyone feels this way. Not everybody feels like they've had soul changes and they want to acknowledge it. I would love to incorporate that kind of language because I think it's really useful. And I think it would allow people to more firmly connect back to like, I like to host an Easter lunch, man. I'm not that fussed about Easter, but every year we do a war with eggs. The winner inexplicably has to wear bunny ears. My grandma made it up. She was super into it. I love that. I'm just not going to pretend like I come from this Jewish place. I am somebody who was raised in a lot of different countries as a Christian by parents with very specific points of view. And I want all of those to influence my Judaism all the time because they do. And I want to be able to acknowledge it. I'm doing this because I was raised in the church. I'm doing this because of my mom's family. And I want to connect back to like Swedish stuff. And it's so cool. You get to walk around the world being this like being of your own complete creation. I did it. I definitely gave myself a Hebrew name. I'm glad I did, like a Hebrew parents' names. I didn't ask my parents how they felt about it. I'm not sure they understand. So I don't think it matters terribly much. But I do see people using those names and using the names of parents in a way that is really powerful and meaningful to them. But maybe we should all be going up as like Bat Olga and Ivan or whatever. Like maybe that's cool. Yeah. My name's tattooed on me because I'm so obsessed with it because it's mine. It's the only one I have that's mine.
It's interesting because I forget where it came up not too long ago, but we were talking about names, and I realized that I don't really feel a strong connection to my name of Dan or Daniel because it actually doesn't come from anywhere. It's my parents liked it. And I want, my middle name is the name of an ancestor. And I think that if I were in a time of life and in a mindset where I was sort of choosing my name, I would probably go by my middle name because I would be looking for something that had meaning. And for me, that would have been the meaning. I mean, you're talking about different meaning. I think that whole question about naming ourselves versus being named and where that all comes from, I think it's fascinating on so many levels. And it's one of these examples that I feel like sometimes maybe the conversion experience highlights it, but then it turns out that it's relevant for everybody. And I've certainly experienced that. And B'nai Lappi has talked about that, about queerness, and that there's so many things that we have found through a queer reading of Jewish text that turns out that it's actually very meaningful for straight people. And therefore, we recognize that the marginalization of the people that we're talking about, queer folk, Jews by choice, that actually is harming them, but also harming all of us. And I don't really have a conclusion there. I just want to put it on the table. I actually wanted to come back to something that you were talking about earlier relating to the difficulty of converting to Judaism. And when you said it earlier, I was thinking, like, should it be difficult? Is it kind of a crucible that it's really important to be difficult because in that challenge, important things happen? Or should we be doing what I think a lot of us are trying to do, like make it easy? In other words, it's not a good thing that it's difficult, but also recognizing that by making it easier, there will be losses as well, right? That crucible is valuable in certain ways. It's just that it comes at a great cost. And I'm often wondering if, on the one hand, it seems so appealing to try to reduce the cost, and on the other hand, you also see what might be lost to the person, what might be lost to the greater society, and yet at the same time, making it super hard makes fewer people able to do it or more likely to turn back. So I'm wondering how you think about all of that question about how hard it should be to become Jewish.
Yeah, I've spent countless hours thinking about this, like so many. So fundamentally, I think you're right. I think there is truth there. And this is a thing that's hard to talk about, which is that like there is a certain amount where there's a crucible. I go and I read through the feelings and like the diary entries and stuff. And I realized most of my diary entries, partly because I started my Jewish life away from a community to convert with, they're all from before I started like conversion classes and stuff. The reality is, if we reduced the barrier to entry a lot, it would still be high. People worry, I think, a lot about a couple different things. They worry about people not understanding the gravity. And again, I don't really know what it's like in the States. I've only done this in places where Jews are an extreme minority and extremely, like the number of people I meet who tell me if they've never met a Jew, I could do it every day of my life multiple times. In that context, for sure, and I can't imagine it's that different in a lot of places in the States, it is hard. It is heart-wrenching. It is confusing. You want to get it so right. Like, it is a crucible. That is already happening for people. And I see programs that are easier and I see programs that are harder. It's important to learn certain things, but there are definitely programs that are like more onerous. And I used to be like, oh, wow, it's so hard and onerous to become a Jew. Like, really to drive home the point, like, I'm really serious about this because this thing is so onerous and hard. Respect me for it. And I have come around a lot because it really can be so much easier and also just accessible. We can make conversion accessible without making it like quote unquote easier. Like, you can't make it intellectually easier, or emotionally or spiritually easier. Can't do it. I really don't think you can. Like, the base material, the base thing that's happening is tough. I think we can be working more, less in terms of like easy, but more in terms of accessibility. So whether we have materials and classes that are online for people like people I've met, trans Jews in rural France. That's how we can make it a lower barrier to entry without, I think, changing this idea that there's like an intellectual rigor and like real commitment to the process.
I want to flash to your Marvelous Mrs. Maisel shout out. Less about the specific content of the character on that show and how I think she is like a perfect example of the like, I need to prove this factor for many converts who, and it makes perfect sense in the context of that show because it is a Jewishness, it is a Judaism, so much about like ethnic Ashkenazi, East European, Central Europeanness, and not about, they occasionally are in a synagogue. Occasionally there's like references to things that we would call quote unquote religious, but mostly it's what people would call sometimes derogatorily cultural Judaism. And I'm like putting that in quotes. And I want to bring it up because Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is like itself the phenomenon of Jewishly flavored TV shows, and engaging with them is kind of something that people who think of themselves as culturally Jewish often will do, even if they're not going to synagogue. I think there is a hidden phenomenon that is way more prominent than people think, that people are embarrassed to talk about, which is that I think a lot of folks who are converting to Judaism, some of their earliest reasons for that are that they saw Yentl or Rugrats or Marvelous Mrs. Maisel or Prince of Egypt, or like fill in the blank. I think this because there are actually some articles publicly where people have said like, I watched Yentl and that spoke to me deeply and it was the first step towards becoming Jewish. I'll throw it in the show notes. Shouts to Hey Alma. But like, I think that it's pretty common. A lot of people are in areas that don't have a lot of Jews in the ways you just talked about. And so they learn about Jews. It could be like a show of Fiddler on the Roof or so, but like they learn about Jews from a TV show or from a movie or from a show. And there's something there that's like, this actually feels interesting. And it's not that immediately like, oh, yep, I'm going to be Jewish now, but it sparks a journey. It sparks some exploration that might eventually lead to a conversion. But I think once it's happened, there's this embarrassment. People don't want to say, like, I converted to Judaism because I watched a show. So I guess I'm curious to think about that. We live in a world where people say, like, oh, you can't convert to a culture. So, like, even when you convert, there's this idea that, like, well, you'll never be able to have certain things. I think you can. I don't really believe there is such a distinction between what we call religion and culture. I also think there's a huge problem with what we mean by that. We usually mean like Ashkenazi, white European culture when we're saying that like converts don't have access. Anyway, like the pieces of this that are not just like adopting religious teachings, adopting values, learning Hebrew, learning stories, like what are some of the challenges and joys around conversion that involve like culture?
So first of all, yes. And this has led me to, I was just Googling to see like, when did the episode come out where Cindy Tova in Orange is the New Black?
We'll throw that in the show notes too.
I saw that, remember being so profoundly impacted. It's one of the most like important pieces of like Jewish media, like, or Jewish representations in media. It's beyond. And I can't remember when it was, but I think it was a long time. Like, I think that episode might have come out in like 14 or 15, like really before I was all the way in this. And I remember watching it. And it's so funny. So first of all, with the cultural stuff, there's a lot of soup, cultural soup that you're floating in. And you get these snippets. You watch Orange is the New Black, you see something really impactful, you pull it. I grew up on Mel Brooks movies and somehow don't have I love them. And now I love them Jewishly. But like, I did not have, my mother loves Mel Brooks. So you can actually consume wildly Jewish content without thinking about Jews if you try hard enough. One, I think those representations matter. I think very few converts can say, this is the moment why I converted. This is the thing. You'll never get the right answer. You become Jewish, you realize you're not even aware, I think. You start living Jewishly and it just like, and you realize that it had already happened. Again, that early experience, like dating someone who loved being culturally Jewish so much and just like wanted to bask in it. Like for me, that was really fun, right? The first time I went to a deli, and then the first time I brought my parents to a deli, which was only last year. We went to a deli in West Bloomfield, Michigan, and it was delightful. I think my mom got a ham and cheese sandwich. So it wasn't that kosher style, but it was a deli much like ones that I've been to in other places. I love that because I love sharing that stuff. When I met Jewish friends earlier in the process, that's the first thing a lot of people would show me. And so for me, and I would suspect for a lot of people, like Jewish pop culture fits in this category, I think often of warm and fuzzy. The Mrs. Maisel thing, I remember just being really affected because it just felt so real. And I was like, she cares so much. And they're all making fun of her and everyone's making fun of me. But like that was also really important. It's very often where people are welcoming you in. Like your friends who aren't religious, you got a Jewish friend who's not religious, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm started to convert, or I'm thinking about converting, or I'm really interested in this. They might not be like, have you read this passage in like Leviticus? They'll be like, yo, we're doing like a Mel Brooks movie night at my like college, like Jewish society or whatever. It's like, come along, right? And like, we're fucking hilarious. Like, Jews are fucking hilarious. And so a lot of it is, I'm swearing a lot. A lot of it is comedy, which is great.
It's funny because when you're talking, I was thinking of the Seinfeld episode where his dentist converts to Judaism and Seinfeld is upset because he thinks he converted only for the jokes, only to be able to tell Jewish jokes. But in a way, like that today, like at that time when that was on Seinfeld, you know, who knows, whatever that was 20, 30 years ago. I mean, now I'm putting myself back in the Stone Age. But that there was a sense that like the joke was that you shouldn't convert just for the jokes.
You know, I keep sort of referencing the fact that it can be very like hard. If there was nothing great, why would we like? Do you know what I mean? Besides spiritual conviction, which in Judaism becomes complicated because we all have really, really different relationships with that, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with our relationship to being Jewish. Yeah, of course, converts are doing it for some of the fun stuff. We have a really fun culture, and like, as it grows and changes and evolves and more people join and there's more mixed families and more people are doing different kinds of Jewish media, like it just gets better. And like, yeah, totally. I'm totally here for Jewish culture because I think it's fun. The jokes are great. I'm terrible at telling Jewish jokes. I only know one. I think I also learned that from my non-Jewish mother-in-law. I'm not even kidding. I think that's
Let's hear it.
The only one I know. Oh, wait, it's been told a million times. It's the one where there's a bunch of rats in the basement of the synagogue and the rabbi's trying to get rid of the rats, and he calls the exterminator, and he does a fire, and he does a prayer, and he does everything, right? You can't get rid of the rats. And one day he has an idea, and he's like, all right, he goes to the board, and he's like, I finally got a solution. We're going to have a bee mitzvah program for the rats. And the board's like, that's weird, but you know what? We'll go ahead. Does a bee mitzvah program for the rats. Never heard from him again.
That's spectacular.
It's not very Judaism.
You are much better at telling Jewish jokes than you give yourself credit for.
Yeah, I feel like
I've heard that one before, but you brought the midrash and you made it, you deepened it with that Ger-ishness.
Well, let's talk about the Ger-ishness for a second. By the way, I will say, just to speak up in favor of the East Coast people, like Lex, I think that, you know, Ger-ish being a interlingual pun also is a Midwestern phenomenon, because I think that I pronounce it as garish. But anyway,
no, I a lot of my puns are based on my Midwest roots. Yeah. I'm a New Englander sort of by choice, but really a Midwesterner by birth.
And I'm a Midwesterner by choice. So,
wow, we've never talked about this flip-flopping we did, Dan.
Yeah, all right, that'll be our next series. But Katie, I just wanted to pick up on what you were talking about in terms of culture, because I think a lot of times when people imagine somebody becoming Jewish for the culture, there's almost a sense that, okay, now this person is trying to put on this identity of an Ashkenazi old man telling these Jewish jokes from the Catskills, and that's what it means to join Jewish culture. But we're talking about something very different, and Judaism Unbound is about something very different, which is saying that this is about what the Jewish culture will become, and the Jewish culture will become where Jews by choice, along with born Jews, where they take it. And so I'm curious how you think about where Jews by choice are moving or might move Jewish culture in a new direction.
Yeah, for sure. When you come in, there's a lot of pressure to assimilate culturally. So for a lot of people, including for me, that was like very Ashkenazi.
And sorry, I really want to hammer home, because assimilate lands on so many ears as assimilate to like non-Jewish culture. You mean there's so much
Jewish
pressure
culture
to assimilate to a kind of Jewishness that is very Ashkenazi, very white.
Mm-hmm. And, I can't speak. I'm here in Spain now. Like, I can't speak to what it's like when people come through the Sephardic community here. But like, so first of all, there is a certain amount of pressure that keeps that culture. And I think that's why we need to get rid of that pressure to fully assimilate, because I think that is perpetuating Ashkenormativity, this idea that like Eastern European Jewishness is like default. Putting pressure on converts doesn't help that at all, because Jews by choice and like everyone who falls into this category of outsiders coming in, we could be pushing it. I don't know if Jews by choice are pushing the culture, but I think we are joining in areas that have been unloved or controversial and strengthening them, where it's not necessarily converts like in charge. And I'm thinking of like Palestinian liberation is a big place. I once sat in Shul with a friend of mine who said right in front of me, was like, oh yeah, like converts, yada yada, but isn't it so horrible about all these people who are converting just so they can say, I'm an anti-Zionist Jew? That's a lot of pressure. I think if we could remove that pressure, I feel like I know a lot of converts who are like on the boundaries, having those conversations with people who have not had conversations with Jews about that. I don't know that I'd say like converts are leading that, particularly because there is a very toxic idea that like we are, and that's not what I see at all.
And for what it's worth, we've gotten emails from folks who are on the conversion process, and I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to name communities, but they have been told that, you're good to go, you're set, you've got all the knowledge you need, but because of the views you have about Israel-Palestine, we're not comfortable with you dunking in the mikveh, doing the final steps to become Jewish. That it is a barrier in the classics, like where that is a veto if you are ready in every other way, but your politics are not aligned with what certain communities want.
Yeah. The rabbi my rabbi in Manchester, who's outstanding, talked to me, and she was really supportive from the get-go. Even in that shul is one of the only places where I've been completely, that shul, that synagogue in Manchester is one of the few places where I have been the most silent when Israel comes up. And this has been like, that is an interest that predates my interest in Judaism for lots of different reasons. I was raised by diplomats. I knew in the Second Tzfat, I knew Palestinian and Israeli diplomat like kids and went to school with them. Like, this has been stewing for a long time, right? I've been interested intellectually in this for a very long time. And it's really the only place where I felt like I don't want to say something because I don't want something to get to the wrong person. And it's not the rabbi. But yeah, I was terrified of losing the privileges that I had to be a leader. And it was a very welcoming shul, but like it's conservative, and it's the UK, so it's even more conservative. So yeah, that's a really big one. But if you think about all the ways that converts, any place where we're currently hemmed in is a place where we could be helping lead in expansion. Because like the flip side of that is like a love for like diasporism, right? For like diasporous Jewish identity, and a love for building a new Jewish identity that is connected to the land and the earth and the soil where we are. And I think converts have that already. I think exploring the edges of like what a diasporous, like a hopeful diasporous identity means, farming movements, like earth-based Jewish movements, all of these are places where like we're primed to do really cool leadership work.
Yeah. So I've got a last question, and this has been the dream for kicking off this unit. I'm so excited for the other episodes we have coming up. But I am flashing to a conversation I had recently. I officiated a wedding. It was super lovely. But so this guy comes up to me, beelines, right after the ceremony. He said to me, we were talking about holidays, and I mentioned that Purim and St. Patrick's Day coincided a couple of years ago. And so I had seen all these Irish Jews doing cool rituals or even just like cute posts on social media. And his response was, wait, there's Irish Jews? And I was like, yeah, of course there's Irish Jews. Like, people convert, and there's interfaith families and blah, 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 blah. And also there are people who are Irish Jews that have just, that's their background of Jewish, even Jews by birth. But I was left in this place of really like, how do we make that question never happen? how do we recognize that there are people that are Jewish in ways we didn't always expect? And we need that. We need that strength. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Like, how do we move to that new place?
Yeah, there's two things, right? We've talked about things that are hard and things that are great, and this is a combination of them. A big reason why that's happening is that Jews feel like they have to be a certain way. So I think changing the way that we talk about what we expect of converts, all of that pressure that we talked about earlier, that is a huge one, because there are people who are erasing the cool stuff about themselves and not passing it on. And that has been celebrated. Like, full assimilation has been totally celebrated. That certainly has to stop. Positively, the stories that we tell as a group on the mainstream are just so boring. And they're so boring at this point. And they're really funny. And I think that we get away with it because a lot of Jewish media is funny and a lot of Jewish culture is cool and interesting, but it's doubled down so hard on stereotypes because they're easy and stories that are really easy to tell. And like, I don't want to open any Jewish like media website and just be bored by stuff. I don't really understand why it has to be that way. People want to know. We're just not shouting enough about this. And partly because a lot of converts don't want to talk about being converts because it's hard and it's complicated. And that has to stop first, because you can't just say, oh, I want you to shout about how you're Irish and Jewish. And I want you to show, oh, well, we're going to put you on the front page or whatever with what you're doing. If you've still got issues around not being Jewish enough, because that's the message that you're getting from around you, you might not do it. So like, it's a combination of things. Like, we have to build things. We also have to fix things. But when we do, it would be amazing.
Thank you so much, Katie, for hopping on. I don't want to say for joining us. You're part of our team, so you're joined, which I guess maybe that's a theme for this whole unit. But this has been super fun to finally have you on the podcast side. So thanks, Katie.
Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future, especially the immediate future, with our amazing unit of episodes about conversion. This has been a great start. We've got so much more fun to have in the next bunch of weeks. So we do want to close out our conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can go to our website where you can learn more about the Onion Yeshiva. You can check out the show notes for this episode at JudaismUnbound.com/podcast. All sorts of good stuff on the website. You can email Dan and I at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And this isn't so much keeping in touch, but you can always support us financially with either a monthly recurring gift or just a one-time donation at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. The last thing that I'll say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.